Okay, thank you all for coming. Especially, I may say, our two visitors from the United Kingdom, which is an absolute delight to have you here. Thank you so much for coming. Well, I'm the chair of the Melbourne Friends of the National Film and Sound, the chairman of the Melbourne branch of the Friends of the National Film and Sound Archive. And I'm assisted in running this event by two of our committee members, Graham Dodsworth and Bruce Watson. Now, I should start off by saying that, of course, this week has been Reconciliation Week, and whose theme this year is calling for action to move forward and to right the many wrongs done to Australia's Indigenous people. We honour the traditional custodians of this land, and we offer our respects to elders past, present and future. Today, our event features a film which is one of Australia's national treasures, the 1927 production of The Kid Stakes. And I do hope that you've all seen it by now, I'm sure you have. We are greatly honoured today by having two of the main people responsible for the rescue and restoration of this truly magical film. We've already given you quite a bit of information about these two giants of film appreciation in Australia, so I'm just going to introduce David Donaldson and John Flaus. Thank you, David and John. And I'm going to start with David. Now, David, there's quite a history here since 1953.
Yes, that's right. It's been going on all this time. I'm still heavily involved in the Kid Stakes.
Right. Well, now, okay, so would you like to start by talking to us, David, about how this film was rescued and why, how it happened and why?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say just a word about how, in fact, it has spread. It's so remarkable that something that was completely unknown to me at the time, and of course it was known to old-timers, but had never been recognised as sort of cinematically important. Let's just look at a couple of images that show how the film has spread. There's the image that everyone who knows anything about film in Australia knows. That's Rob or young Ordell as Fatty Finn. Can I point out he's in his scout uniform? It's a bit ragged, but he's in his scout uniform. And then nextly, to show the film has spread, there's Grapevine Video. They're a pirating outfit, or shall we say a slightly loose sort of outfit in the United States, of which they have many there. And they have somehow got hold of a copy of the Kid Stakes. They put their own organ soundtrack on it, which I don't much like, but they did pick up the original poster. So the film has spread into the United States among the film-loving community. And another picture of images is this one, Bruce. The fourth Australian History and Film Conference. We can't see it in the picture, but it was 1987. And already by 1987, it was the picture to use if you were going to have a conference on history and film.
Oh, okay, David. Now, Will, you've talked about it being pirated in the US, and then there's the 87 History and Film Conference. But what about some of the other different things that have happened since then?
Well, the flyer we're looking at just now is from one of the Adelaide film festivals that the Kid Stakes was shown at. Rather amazingly, it was shown in two different Adelaide film festivals, evidently because one director didn't know what the other had done, and that's pretty common in that field. So, in other words, you see up the top there with Adelaide Symphony Orchestra live in Her Majesty's Theatre, which is quite a place. It's the old Fuller Theatre. Goes back to the turn of the previous century, and a real centre in Adelaide. So that was a real recognition for the Kid Stakes just to be in that place. And the next one it is the news article. This was a half page. I'm only showing a bit of it. A half page by Louis Naurer when the National Film Archive put out the DVD after a fair bit of work was done in 2015. And he very rightly points out the film is full of symbolism. Right at the end, which I'm not showing, he manages to get wrong the name of the cinematographer, but we'll come back to that. And the next thing to see is, yes, this is where it all began, or slightly, the bulletin in 1954 of the Sydney University Film Group. Now, I'll just say how these things happened. It was in 1953. I was a research assistant with this nascent university in Sydney, and I had some time, so I went to the newsreel, completely amazed to find this thing burst on the screen. I don't know if it will mean much to a lot of people, but we were looking there at not only at celluloid, but the original nitrate celluloid from 1927 was actually being projected there in front of us. I can't tell you how beautiful it looked. And the pictures of Sydney just were so glorious. I can't remember what I thought about the story because I was just taken so much by it visually. And I don't know whether it had sound or not. Probably just the sound of people laughing, which I always say is the best sound of all. Now, as I came out, there was another fellow staggering into the foyer, Neil McPhillamy, and we looked at each other and said, my God, what was that? Something has to be done about that. And a lot of things were done by a lot of people. I believe the working group actually was 11, included Ian McPherson, after whom the lecture is named in the Sydney Film Festival these days, and Joel Greenberg, wrote a book and a lot of journalism. A lot of people worked on that, rescuing that film. And of course, it was all part of the Film Society movement of the time. There were certainly more than 35 film societies operating in New South Wales then. And it was a time when the National Library was taking an interest in film, though not a big interest. And the moves were underway to develop the Australian Film Institute. That took a long time, but it got done. So we were right in the middle there.
Can I interrupt you for a minute, David, please?
Yes.
I'm absolutely intrigued, before you start talking about the Sydney University Film Society, about the fact that at that time in the early 1950s, that Sydney University had two film appreciation groups. The SU Film Society, which you said was mainly engineering students, and the SU Film Group, the Sydney University Film Group, who were mainly arts and architecture students. And there was also a third group involved with the rescue of the kid stakes, the Sydney Scientific Film Society. I'm basing this on, I think I'm on your article, which is published online. But the reason I'm particularly interested about the engineers, because I can remember I'm interested in the engineers were interested, because certainly in my university days, the engineers mostly had a different kind of reputation, which was confirmed by my son at a different generation, who's an engineer. He said, yes, they were mostly interested in drinking beer, but they were obviously interested in film. So the fact that you had two different societies at Sydney University, I find quite intriguing.
Well, just on the engineers, and I'm still in touch with one of those, by the way, Peter Aslin. Of course, they were locked, well, not locked, they were secluded upstairs in the projection room. So I dare say a good deal of beer was consumed. But the important thing is they loved tinkering with the mechanics and with the amplifier too. And sometimes a year would start and the new set of film staff couldn't tell what the last set had done with the gear, but it was a sort of laboratory for mechanical and electrical engineering. From their point of view, they were not specially interested in films, as far as I know. Those people, they just loved the gear. That was the society. I was in the group, which was the big name there is Peter Hamilton, a polymath indeed. And of course, many people will know Judy Adamson, Judith Gollan in those days, fabulous young, I believe, first-class honours in French, but she devoted her life to film from then on, her whole life. So this whole thing, as I say, was transcendental to me. I had to go and meet what then seemed to be a very old gentleman, indeed he was, Jerry Taylor of National Films. He had his office and his vault of nitrate film up on the top of the City Tattersalls building in Pitt Street. A good thing, because if it exploded, it would all go upwards. So, and he had Jerry himself and his enterprise is the subject for a complete thesis. He had such a wonderful store of old films there, and luckily he was nice to us. I'll say one last thing. In fact, I'll come back to the Sydney Scientific Film Society, which again was a very active outfit. One of their, I believe the treasurer, Jack Kennedy, had in his kitchen, or shining into his kitchen, had a 35mm projector. So when we obtained the film, it was all cut up into many, many pieces in order to make the short films for the newsreel. And someone had to stick it together. That fellow was a young medical student, John Morris. John spent many weeks, probably months, with Jack Kennedy working out where the film should be joined together. In other words, when we see the film now, it's not Tal Ordell's film, it's actually John Morris's film. But if it hadn't been, and this is always the case with film, if it isn't for the gear, you haven't got film. If Jack Kennedy had not had that 35mm projector, then that film could never have been stuck together, and no one would be seeing it to this day. One last thing. After all this effort, which took a coherent group of people about 2 years, it so happened that visiting Melbourne was Mary Field, who was the world authority in those days on children's films. And she visited Sydney. Well, in fact, she had to leave overseas from Sydney. You couldn't do that from Melbourne then. You had to come from Sydney to leave Australia. It was so simple. We commissioned a 16mm print. I went out to Kingsford Smith Mascot, walked on the tarmac. She was getting up, about to climb the stairs. No tunnels in those days. And I put it in her hands and said, Britain needs this film. Partly that was insurance in case something else went wrong at this end, which there was some danger of. And just quite recently, I checked with the National Film and Television Archive in Britain, and yes, they safely have that film completely pristine as it was back in the 1950s.
Wow. Well, do you want to move on now, Dave, to talk about the film and what's in it? And I think you want me to say a few words at this stage, don't you?
I do. Well, this is how we met, Gwenda. It's because you're interested in children and I'm interested in film, and those two interests met in the kid stakes.
Yes, that's true. Yes, I was a lecturer in child development at one stage, and also helped to set up the Children's Folklore Collection at Museum Victoria. But the question, of course, is this just a children's film? And of course, it's not. It's not. It's a film for everyone, in my view. Certainly, children would love the kid stakes. I mean, it's the main actors are all children, and kids would love to, you know, all the fighting and the jiggery pokery that's going on, and the tricks and so on. But the kids would also pick up, I think, the parodies of adult life, which is such a feature of this film. I mean, children love parodies. There are hundreds of them in the among the thousands of children's rhymes in the Australian Children's Folklore Collection, which is held at Museum Victoria. And for instance, and children love to satirise the adult world too, such as in their parodies of rhymes, such as, well, let's have a think. My bonny lies over the ocean, my bonny lies over the sea, my daddy lies over my mummy, and that's how they got little me. Yes, so there's hundreds of those, and so kids would love parody too. But anyway, but the kid stakes is unquestionably a social satire, and I think John might have something to say about that a bit further along. But I mean, it parodies a number of adult issues: romance, thrillers, fraud and bribery, of which case the bribes were marbles, the stinkies and the alleys, of course, and secret societies and oaths and politics too. And David, in your article online, which you've mentioned that the original Fatty Finn cartoonist, Sid Nichols, was a confirmed socialist. And I always have a laugh at the very early in the film, Fatty's call to his comrades, you know, and they have to giving the traditional fisted salute, you know, while they're playing cricket. It always reminds me of Gough Whitlam, how he called everybody comrades whenever I hear that. But anyway, it's but I know you've, John, your view of this is that I think at one stage you said it's an adult fantasy about childhood. Do you want to talk about that a bit more?
Well, yes, these here are adults retelling the past, their own past. Of course, they're fictional characters, but it's their own past that they are telling, either the past they lived or the past that they wished to live but were denied. And that's what they're doing now in this story. That is those who make it, but for those adults who watch it, they can relive and reconstruct. I'll quote something here, a little two-line verse. Myth affirms where history must surmise. If the dead could speak, they'd tell us lies. So that's, in a sense, what the retelling of the past is all about. Not only one's own past, or that which is considered to be historically so, but simply the telling of those stories. Every one of those kids represents something, but that is an attitude or a position in the culture of Australia of that time. That's just, how will I put it? Australia's still a colony. It's a British colony in that time. I'm going back all those years now. Yes. And so the members of that group, of Fatty's group, I find them that's so interesting. And there are girls from time to time. There's a few skirts appear with the group as they move around one place to another. And one of the boys seems to be of First Nations. He seems to be Aboriginal. Now, there's two ways to look at this, and I really can't resolve what might have been the intention of the filmmakers. But one, the presenting of this, that what in that little group of kids there in Sydney, there's an Abo. One of the kids is an Abo, and that would concern quite a few of the Australians that I grew up. I mean, my parents' generation, I think, would have been worried about. But the way in which the film has been shot, I don't think that lad gets a single moment of first attention from the camera. He's not given a single on his own, not that's in the version we have now anyway. So the filmmakers, were they in the first place intending to show that a group what are we going to call them for the moment, comrades, they could have a member, at least one, who was not Caucasian, was not English, and simply for him to be part of the group was so much to be accepted in the values of that group that the story as it proceeds does not take the boy into a close point of isolation. It doesn't separate him out from the others to examine him. He's accepted. His membership is simply there. It is not to be dramatically questioned as this narrative unfolds. So there are two ways to look at it. It seems to me to debate what the intentions, two ways to look at the intentions of filmmakers, storyteller, of course, but director as well. Was that Aboriginal boy there simply as some kind of a gesture or a concession, simply that? Or was that boy there meant to be, was it meant to be important? And by not giving him special attention, that meant that his, how will I put it, his right to belong is natural, unquestioned. If that's so, then this is so early in the Australian culture of which I know. Now, I think David has opinions. He may not want to agree with me about this, but that's how I feel about this film.
I agree. It's darned interesting, John, and the presentation in the frame of that young fellow as he comes to bowl. He's a bowler in cricket, and think how important cricket was at that time. Test cricket, extremely big at that time. So this is another parody, actually, in the film. He is treated completely seriously as a competent member of society.
Yes.
That's not true of the adults. We see at least two adults. One is a fisherman. I'm guessing he's Maltese or Italian, and he is made a little bit of a figure of fun because it's his window that gets smashed by that cricket ball, and he gesticulates and so on in a way that I believe Tal Ordell would have coached him to be your typical Dago sort of, although it's quite affectionate. And secondly, there's the Chinaman later on. Yeah. And again, he's made gentle fun of, but that Aboriginal boy is taken perfectly seriously. Yes.
Yes.
It's very interesting. I mean, Sid Nichols, I think one or both of you, David and John, have said that that he was a socialist, and he did have, you know, fairly radical views for the time. So
yes, he had a complete life in politics outside the funny stuff in the Sunday paper. He was a much larger citizen than simply a fellow who drew cartoons.
Yeah. What an interesting story that is. I want to ask you too, John, while you're here, is to talk to you about some of the locations in the film. And in particular, I've had a lot of discussions with you about the Macalone Steps in Woolloomooloo Stairs, this huge dramatic flight of steps, and with the scene where there's only ever one child, the little Lord Fauntleroy from Potts Point, who eventually becomes part of the gang, and the kids. But, you know, I've said to you already that sequence of featuring the stairs definitely reminds me of Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin, you know, the famous scene on the Odessa steps. But anyway, but you've got special knowledge about the Macalone Stairs, haven't you?
Well, I lived for some time during the 1960s when my kids were all young, you know, just getting to school age. We lived in Macalone, just off Macalone Street, a place called Ray Place, and just a walk, 100 yards walk down Macalone, out of Ray Place into Macalone, and there were the Macalone Steps. And the thing is that those steps themselves helped to, they provided access for people to get from the lower area, the working class area of Woolloomooloo, which is real blue-collar Main Streets part of Australia. But if you could climb this flight of steps, And there weren't all that many of them. There was a bit of a you struggle to get up for some of us. When you got to the top into Broome Street, you were now in Potts Point. And that what separated Woolloomooloo from Potts Point, for the most part, was a cliff face. And that little place that I lived in Ray Place, was just tucked into the bottom of the cliff. But the stairs, if you got down to the Macalone stairs, it was possible now to get up to the top. But the stairs themselves were not as wide as they appear in one shot of that little boy, what shall we call him? He's not a fugitive from Potts Point, but at least he's for a while dropping out of it. When he comes down that staircase, there is one splendid vista, and that ain't the Macalone stairs, that shot. The rest of it certainly is. And for me, that was so important to live in this part of Australia, in what was waterfront Sydney, and there's the docklands on one side, and there's, you know, what are we going to say? The eminent persons, high profile mob, you know, leisure class, some of them, they've all got a quid, that mob that live up there. And what's so endearing about the story in the film is that one lad, one little boy, decides to come down the stairs. He descends. And then what sort of response did he get from his contemporaries, from the little kids his age who live down there? They give him a hard time to begin with, but he stands up to them. And that means it's going to be a test of, not just of strength, because in a fight, someone usually wins, and if the other loses, no, it's not a test of strength, it's a test of spirit. How much spirit you'll get in there and you'll fight, whether you win or lose, you'll fight. And that's what happens. And that little kid from up top, when he gets down here amongst the toughies, he's there, he's in with them. And Fatty later on says, I hit him because I didn't know that he was going to fight back. I didn't know he could fight. And so that's, I won't say that they are lessons. It's not as though there's something to be taught, but nonetheless, demonstrations of that kind about class distinctions in Australia, in what was its oldest, if not its most esteemed city at that time, that this is an image of an ideal. Part of, we understand this with myths. Myths are structures whereby, narrative structures whereby our feelings, whether they be concerns, fears of something, or yearnings for something we don't have, or fears of something that's coming at us, that the mythical narrative is the structure whereby these feelings can be played out for us, whether it be in our own dreams, or whether it be in the stories told down at the pub or at the street corner, or whether they turn up on the screen. They're part of the pictures. And
I'm going to bring. I'm sorry, David. David, you wanted to say something?
Well, I want to say that it's part of the genius of, I believe, Arthur Higgins, rather than Tell or Dell, to have captured all of that locale stuff. Which, by the way, he knew very well, because he had already, years before, he had photographed the sentimental bloke in Woolloomooloo, and I think it's called Sunshine Sally, also in the same location. So he was very familiar with every nook and cranny, and by crikey, he makes use of it. But more broadly, John, you were saying to me, of course, we have to realise this was not a studio film. There really were not studios in those times in Australia anyway, but in the way we understand them now. But it was a completely independent film, scuffling really on the outside and grabbing what they could. And the point that you made, John, is it's how much of it is exteriors.
Yeah, oh yes, yes, it's just not interiors. So all of that one of the expensive elements, one of the dimensions of film production is the use of artificial lighting. And not that they didn't have some lighting even in those exterior shots, but the lighting doesn't serve the same. It serves the same purpose, but it doesn't do as much work in exteriors as it does in interiors. And there was scarcely any time that we might have noticed that the lighting, whatever was the source of the lighting, was not natural. There were just a few occasions when we saw that, I think, in the film.
Well, I think we've actually moved on to our next topic, which is the one of who made the film, and we've been talking about this because you, David, you've been talking about Arthur Higgins too, and you know, whether in fact he should be considered the you know, the joint maker of the film together with Tal Ordell. But do you want to say a few things now, David, on the subject of you know, who made the film, that it was not a mainstream production and so on?
Well, well, yes, and that is clear right on the very first frame pretty well, that says an Ordell Coyle production. Well, the ordinary audience just says that we always have companies that say who produced it, but obviously they are on the screen there for a purpose for those who know. And nobody seems to ask themselves, what does Ordell Coyle mean? Who was Ordell? He was a working actor, but very important and well known in Sydney, well known throughout Australia, as a matter of fact, as an actor, had his own acting company. But who was Coyle? An Ordell Coyle production. Virgil Coyle had been a publican in Townsville in Queensland. He had 2 vaudeville theatres in Townsville. They turned into film theatres in Townsville. And in 1923, not long before this film that we're talking about, Virgil Coyle joined with another fellow called Birch, B-I-R-C-H. Birch was a publican in Rockhampton, and I think Bundaberg perhaps, and he had theatres, and they joined themselves with the Carroll brothers, who were already very big in film in Brisbane. So when those 3 people got together, they had a string of cinemas all the way up the coast of Queensland, and they were big cinemas. I'd like to go on.
You called them at one stage their Winter Garden, the Winter Garden, and you talked about in 1924, and which you said was the first of the great picture palaces.
Yes, that was the Carrolls. And what do you know? When the Kid Stakes was first premiered, it was at the Winter Garden in Brisbane, not in Sydney. But let me just go back and I'll come back to that, talk to the Sydney character who does matter. That is Arthur Higgins. Arthur Higgins had been a working cinematographer since 1911. So by 1927, he was the professional around Sydney. In fact, he is ticket number one ticket holder of the Cinematographers Society. So Arthur Higgins is really somebody in Australian film. And when you look at the sentimental bloke, as many of us will have more than once, we realise how important the photography was there too. Well then, well, just to say, what could Arthur Higgins do? I think, Bruce, we could be ready with our I'll just say what these things are. These are enlargements from the frame. What we are looking at is not stills in the conventional sense that are taken by a still photographer. Good. They are enlargements from the frame. Now and again, you'll see, in fact, on this one, you can see a hair up in the top right-hand corner, I believe. And you can see some scratchy marks. A fellow called Ron Israel was the projectionist at the Newslux. He had the skill to produce 8x10 pictures off the frame of the film. They were pinned in the foyer in the conventional way, as ordinary stills are. Luckily, at the conclusion of the season, I asked Ron, do you want those stills? He said, of course not. So I have them to this day. These things you're looking at go back to 1953, made from 1927. Ron, by the way, became a big-time commercial photographer in Sydney later on. I want to say, isn't that It's not in widescreen, but isn't that one beautiful panorama? There's the...
Liz Oley wants to know what's the big building on the top left. It's a church, obviously, I suppose.
Well, I'm sure John Flaus can tell us that.
Oh, okay.
I wish I could, but I've been looking at it wondering.
Surely
I've been looking at it there.
Surely that's the backside of St Mary's Cathedral.
Well, I'd never seen it from that angle, even though I lived in East Sydney long enough. But I'd never seen it from that angle. But I suppose that's what it could be.
Well, I agree it's a bit odd because that could be, is that the dome of the Queen Victoria building just beside it there?
That's what I'm wondering. Yeah.
I don't know.
Thank you.
But to go back, there on the skyline, there are the cranes on the skyline, and these, back to the panorama, Bruce, and then there's the domain with all its trees, which would have been very well known to every inhabitant of Sydney in the 1920s, small city that it was then. And then in the foreground, look how marvellous this is. There's what used to be called a lorry, the lorry with the bales of wool, which are on their way to the freighter on the wharf slightly off to the right that we don't see. And in the middle there is a sort of lone tree in Woolloomooloo. Higgins has put that picture together. I don't think Tell or Dell told him to do that. By the way, that probably is on the middle right, is probably what is now the Finger Wharf or something it's called, isn't it? Famous place these days.
Yeah.
So in one sublime picture, Arthur Higgins has captured your heart, it seems to me. Let's look at the next one. This is on the way into the film, into the story. We've got 3 slides here. Gwenda was mentioning the sequence of the slides. The first picture, Bellevue. Oh, well, Bellevue. In point of fact, that was a waterfront property in its day at the bottom of Potts Point before Garden Island was expanded by the Navy. And it's a very elaborate house, as you see in the film. That belonged to a fellow who himself was theatrical, Hugh Ward. He was an entrepreneur. So my guess is Hugh Ward, who had money, and Tell or Dell, who had a story in mind, got together and set their film inside Bellevue. Look where the kid is on the bottom right there. Now look at the next shot. Ha! It's the reverse angle, and he's peering in wonder there. And let's see the next one. It's the same kid, the same, but look, a much closer shot. I think there's genius in the construction of some of the sequences in the kid stakes. Now let's go on to the next one. It still also has this kid. The name they gave him in the story, by the way, was Algernon. To sort of poke fun at Potts Point. I'd love to know what the big building is behind him there, but here he is starting his, what we've already discussed, his voyage from Potts Point down into Woolloomooloo. Actually, looking there, I reckon this is a different set of stairs. I think the cinematographer has found a good location. Isn't this beautifully composed? Isn't that just a lovely picture? He has found a composition there at the top of what I think is Butler Stairs. And then we shift, thanks Bruce, to the wider shot of him coming down McElhone Stairs. And how expressive aren't those 2 pictures in sequence? I think this true creative talent has gone into the cinematography of this film. And just to point to that one last still at this stage. Here's Bruiser Murphy. I'm going to take chat off for myself, I hope. Well, no, I don't seem to be able to. But if you look at the detail that is in this picture, my God, look at that doorstep.
Yeah.
That is a step that has been trodden for 50 or 60 years before the date of the film, possibly 80 years before the date of the film. That's a point, by the way, that in 2015, Lucy Turnbull made as a historian talking about this film. She said how much of Woolloomooloo it had captured that is no longer there for us to see. Because then in 1927, you could capture what had been there in 1880 or 1860. And this is one of them. Look at the texture of that door.
Yeah.
Look at the texture of the bricks. Just behind it, there's a leaning over a bit paling fence. There's the unpaved alleyway. And in the middle of it is big Bruiser Murphy. He comes from a tough environment. Seems to me that Arthur Higgins has expressed Bruiser Murphy there, not only with the young actor, but my heavens, isn't that a beautiful picture? Good. I hope I've said that. So I'm thinking it's no wonder that in the film, the credits panel very unusually says, written and directed by Tal Ordell. That's the standard thing. In the same panel, cinematography, Arthur Higgins. It's an absolute must in a film these days, and for a very long time, that the director gets the credit on a panel by the director self, because the director's a person. But here that credit is shared. And I believe it's shared for very good reason. That is, I believe that it is Tal Ordell wrote the skits. That's what they are. It's not a script. It's just a whole set of skits with kids, sort of thing you would do in vaudeville, which is where he came from. And he wrote those intertitles with all the puns that are so funny for adults. And yes, he coached the kids how to behave. But the guy who created the visual film was Arthur Higgins. John agrees with me that it has a special magic, I think.
Oh, it does, yes.
It certainly is. I'm wondering now, do you, David, do you want to go back to Queensland at this stage? Because we were talking about Rockhampton and then we moved back to Sydney.
Yes.
Because Rockhampton, like Woolloomooloo, is a key star of the film in the sense that they had to have the famous goat race in Rockhampton. Is that not correct?
Well, that is right. And there's statements about films get repeated over and over and over again in print. But when you look at them, you wonder sometimes, is that so? Who said that first? And in this case, the statement is that the goat race had to be filmed in Queensland because races had been banned in New South Wales. Mm-hmm. I believe it is true that races had been banned in New South Wales, but that's not why the goat race was filmed in Queensland. Oh. The reason was that Ordell was a working actor. He was on tour up and down Queensland. He saw those goat races. The creative dramatic soul in him said, my heavens, we've got something here. And he would have teamed up with Virgil Coyle, who would have had money and access to theatres to show the film. And so it's Ordell Coyle Productions. So I maintain that the film actually has a substantial Queensland genesis. It is not John Flaus always thought, and I always thought, and everybody always thought, this is a Sydney film. It's set in Sydney. It's cast in Sydney. Its locations are for a large part in Sydney, but the guts of the film, Gwenda, is in Rockhampton because that's where the idea occurred and that's where the money was. Birch, Carroll and Coyle. By the way, Birch, Carroll and Coyle is an important element to this day in the greater union organisations, extending as far as to own all the theatres in Darwin. So they are a huge organisation in themselves. We're looking at the beginnings of all that enterprise. It's terrific. So, and what's more, the Carols, they premiered the Kid Stakes at the Winter Garden, the picture palace that they had in Brisbane. Then it's a matter of how do you crack Sydney, because Sydney is tied up by union theatres and the Combine, the monopolistic arrangements they had at the time. But Dan Carroll was a partner with a fellow called Musgrove, and they owned the Prince Edward Theatre in Castlereagh Street, Sydney. Another, actually the quote there was, it had been built in 1924, so it was brand new at this time. It was the first cathedral of motion pictures in Sydney. Well before the State, which everybody knows now, the Prince Edward was. The foyer was about 100 yards long, full of marble and everything. It was terrific.
And when you entered the theatre, there was someone playing an organ.
Yes.
A Wurlitzer, perhaps?
Beg pardon?
Wurlitzer, perhaps? The organ, would it have been a Wurlitzer?
Oh, I don't know what the name was, but it was.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. We'll just a generic organ we'll agree on. Okay.
Now, what I want to say is that it's clear that when they had it stitched up with coil, Tal Ordell, the actor, and his son, Robin Ordell, Fatty Finn, great screen character, the two of them went up to Rockhampton. I don't reckon anybody else would have gone up to Rockhampton. That's a hell of a long way to go for professional people. I don't think that Arthur Higgins went up to Rockhampton. You look at the shots in Rockhampton and contrast the shots in Sydney, there is a different hand at work.
Yes.
I reckon in Rockhampton there's a working newsreel cameraman. And yes, he captured the race. By the way, you'll see that all the kids in the race more or less obscure their faces, because you never see Bruiser Murphy in that race. Bruiser Murphy was back in Sydney as a child actor. He never went to Rockhampton. And when you look at all that race sequence that is the climax of the film, watch, and I hope people will go back to Ozflix or YouTube and have a look at this. You watch how it's all cut together. There's audience shots by Higgins taken in Sydney with his beautiful richness, and then there's plane shots taken in Rockhampton by this other guy, and cut. It's all very fast. You, the audience, just swim along with it, but in point of fact, you're seeing two different hands at work in two different places there. I think it's there's a lot of film know-how. And again, I'll say, of course, that was not Ordell's, that was Higgins's know-how, how to construct that sequence. Nobody gets a credit for the editing in this film. Ask yourself, who was the editor?
Yes.
I think it's obvious.
But there is something else, David, about that.
Oh, no, sorry, can I just say, we ought to show the plainness of the photography and the cheating that goes on. Yes, Bruce, how's this? Here's young Fatty racing for the finish line. Where is anybody else in the picture? No, this is taken somewhere in Rockhampton. That's not an Arthur Higgins picture. It's a very skillful picture because they're belting like hell. The camera's on the truck where we are looking at that picture coming away, and they're holding him belting into the picture. It's a very clever shot, but it's not a rich shot.
No.
So I think that's Robin Ordell in Townsville, that one.
Yeah. John, you were just about to say something.
Oh, yes, that it's in that sequence, in all of that section of the story, that we saw camera moves, some panning moves by camera. Elsewhere, they weren't there. I mean, that's got to be part of Higgins's way of working in those days, was that he just wasn't using camera moves. So it was continually cutting from one fixed position to another. Therefore, the importance of filling the screen for each one of those takes with whoever was needed in the story, because very rarely did anyone enter frame. So it's fixed frame. Scarcely ever did anyone enter or exit, but that style of working seems to me that in this film, it's not something that I object to. I do in contemporary filmmaking today, or motion picture making, most of it's for television these days. There's so much of that, even dialogue scenes in which people, two characters who are only a few feet away from each other, each of them is given a tight single of their own to speak their lines, and is cut to the other and back and so on. And this is sometimes, I'm told by someone in the industry told me this, it's not called coverage anymore, that's called smotherage. It's equivalent in another field. If storytelling were being spoken or written, using words, if you were to have to listen to a story in which every sentence was a simple sentence without any clauses or phrases even, and if you could think of that, how long could you tolerate even a short story which consisted of simple sentences, each one having only one verb? And yet the equivalent of that in motion picture is if you keep cutting from one fixed frame to another and back again, if your subject is adults. But here we are in the kids' stakes, our subject is not adults getting involved in adult situations, it's children playing out what are the childlike beginnings of such. And it seems to me that that works very well if the narrative is about children, even if it's not for children, it's for adults, but it's about children. And so that style, that mise en scène style, to me is quite suitable in the kids' takes, and yet I object to it in one production after another that I see on contemporary screens.
Gosh, yes. Thank you, John. I tell you what, Evan Maynard has kindly just informed me that, yes, the Prince Edward Theatre did have a Wurlitzer organ, so I was right about it. It was a Wurlitzer, yes. I think I grew up on stories about the Wurlitzers rising from the depths, from Hades below. But I wanted at this stage to ask, actually, David, I've got my eye on the time, and I think that it might almost be time to start calling in the chats, because there have been quite a number of, really interesting comments. But before we do that, I just want to say, David, do you want to actually, tackle the last section of what you would like to say about this film before we move on to taking this general discussion?
Well, I'd like to say it's like many works of art that the artists did not really know what they were doing. They had their instincts, they had their urges, and they set to work and they did it. And both in its the social content, the satire, and in the loving picture of Sydney by people who, of course, were themselves based in Sydney, and in the view of childhood, and especially in those, to me, beautiful compositions, because, yes, that filming style is extremely simple. Well, it goes back to Griffith, I suppose, when, after all, Higgins learnt his trade 1911. But the compositions, to me, are themselves works of art. So this whole film, accidentally, what was put out as an entertainment, actually a support at the Prince Edward. The nature of the trade was such that Paramount had to have the big picture there, but they squeezed the kids' stakes in as a support, and that was its history around the place, except at the premiere. And they thought they'd make an entertainment. They thought they'd possibly make money, but they didn't know they were making a work of art. To my mind, they outstandingly did. And I'm outstandingly privileged that I was sitting there in the news lux and all of that spread out in front of my eyes in that beautiful old celluloid. So I'm a very privileged person.
And I'll tell you what, and we are very privileged to have you with us today, David, and John Flaus too. And but I won't finish thanking you yet, but I think it perhaps Bruce, who's in Tech Guru today, we might perhaps move on to take have a look at some of the the chats that people have put in, and then and of course either David or John or both may want to respond to them. So do you want to flash us up some chats, Bruce?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think the first one is actually a point that Alex brought, and maybe Ray that wants to respond to this, which was about Sid Nichols as an artist, and just asking whether whether in the archives, whichever archives, there is more Sid Nichols material around, and also I think Ray might address the issue around other film involvement that he had.
Well, Bruce, if I can respond to that, I'd have to check the credits, look at Pike and Cooper or something to see all the other any other involvements that Sid Nichols had as an art title writer. I think he did do work for other films, but the strip itself remained until 1977. In fact, for about 6 months before Nichols, he seemed to keep drawing it almost up until his death. For about the 6 months before he died, it was clear that the Senate Herald was reprinting old strips, but they just kept doing it until after his death, and so, which I think was a wonderful gesture. There was one episode of the strip, and I don't have it to hand, about the making of the kid steaks. It's actually a comic strip episode where Fatty is discovered and he's taken to the huge Coyle Waddell studio in a very flash car, you know, so Coyle and Waddell are the two big shots, and they discover Fatty, and he's the star of the film. It's a wonderful strip. So it was part of the comic strip. But Nichols also drew a pirate adventure called Mitty Malone, which went on for many years, and he published Fatty Finn's Weekly and the Fatty Finn comic, which also ran for many years in the 40s. So it was Fatty lived very large in the 40s and 50s, but I'd have to go back and check about his actual involvement in other films.
I should mention that Ray Edmondson is the national president of the Friends of the Film and Sound Archive, and is in a very good position to be able to find out. But as he says, he will have to go back and check about Sid Nichols' other films. Okay, Bruce, do you want to...
I was just going to mention that very the little sequence right at the start of the film. I presume that is Sid Nichols' drawing there. Yeah. That's a really seems like a very innovative technique in the film, the way that the film starts, and it draws the parallel between the comic strip and the movie. Yes,
well, I think the poster itself is would be Nichols' own work, and I might add here just a bit of and David could comment on this. About what I call the archaeology of the film. When Jerry Taylor died, his widow Dorothy inherited his stock in trade, which is all his film library. And I guess at that point the distributorship closed down. But she lived in a weatherboard house in Mossman, and it was full of nitrate film. And she spent years working through the stock of the distributor's stock, being sure that every reel of film went to a good home. A lot of it came to the archive. A lot of it went to Cine Sound. Material would have gone elsewhere, I guess. And I would visit her. I would visit her regularly, and to collect films to take back to Canberra. And on one occasion, I sort of fossicked under a bed in the spare room where all the old posters were. She had a pile of old posters. So there were 2 copies of the Kid Stakes poster there, day bills, and then there were also a number of copies of the day bills for The Term of His Natural Life, which I guess Jerry Taylor would have picked up for residual runs once the film stopped being a major release.
Bruce,
I could just add, if I could just add there,
yes.
It was from Jerry Taylor that the print came of Metropolis in 1952. And it was the original UFA 1920s release that he had sequestered away. In fact, I believe he bought up that film, that company, Cinema Art Films. I don't quite know the history there. But Metropolis came out again in Sydney in 1952, stretched out to sound speed with a Boozy and Hawkes soundtrack on it, and re-released in theatres, all the Vogue at Double Bay for one, and all over the place that Jerry Taylor could place it. So he was a very vigorous exploiter and supporter of old film.
Evan, would you just like to speak to the comment that you've just put in the comments? I can't see Evan, but he's made a comment.
Well, I can see Evan's comment. We should look under our
there
bed.
he is. We can see now, Evan. Would you just like to say that?
Yeah, I can say that. I was saying, like, speaking about all the posters and stuff under the bed, well, is that where they found the Kelly gang, under someone's bed? I seem to recall back in the 70s or something, that's where they found it, someone's bed in an old house or something like that.
Could I respond to that, Bruce? The 1906 Kelly Gang film was found in pieces. First of all, in a can of little snippets of film that came to the film archive. Back in the days that we're in the National Library, and several of those pieces about a foot long. They were shots from the Kelly Gang because we had the original program booklet. We could identify the actual shots, and the film stock itself had square perforations and not normal perforations. Then a headmaster in Victoria turned up some rolls of original negative. He told me they were found under the floorboards of a demolished house, which had belonged to a guy called Ernie Goldhawk, who was a film collector. And he gave them to us. And so there were about 3 or 4 minutes of original negative, included the Stringy Bark Creek Massacre and I forget what else. Thirdly, in about 1980-81, some kids were fossicking around on a rubbish dump in Melbourne. I mean, this is a classic story, finding stuff on the rubbish dump. Well, they found a can of film. Didn't know what it was. They took it to the Office of Cinema Papers, which was the film magazine of the time, and they sent it on to us in Canberra. And it was another 5 minutes or so of the Kelly Gang film, partly decomposed, but we saved what we could. And finally, a sequence from the film was located in the National Film Archive in London under a different title. Nobody quite knew what it was, and somehow someone at the archive was able to identify that it was a sequence from the Kelly film. So that's where the pieces have come from the 1906 film. And but that is how these things turn up, and we're just very fortunate that at least that much of the film survives. And you can replicate those sorts of stories from many other films.
Yeah, I didn't mean to get on top of you then, sorry. I was just making the comment just because it was relevant to some under people's beds. But no, it was near enough under the bed, it was under the floorboards.
Yeah. Okay, look, I might throw over to Peter Krause now. He's got a bit of a double barrel question. Peter, your video's turned off, but that's fine. If you can, there you are. If you could ask your question, thanks.
Yeah, I'm just intrigued as to the significance of Kid Stakes being presumably the last silent film made in Australia, and whether there were any other silent films that were being produced at that time, knowing that it was about, 1928 when the Jolson story started to be shown around the world, including, I think, in Australia. And my second question was about Fatty Finn and its relevance to our discussions of Kid Stakes.
Well, Gary has put his a message up there that I can see. Later films than the Kid Stakes are The Far Paradise and The Cheetahs, and the McDonough sisters film The Cheetahs is sort of celebrated, well known, because they copped that change from silent to sound right on the spot. They'd made their film silent and it wasn't any use at that stage. Now, that's not completely true. It was no use in the picture palaces of the major cities. Of course, silent film rolled on in various parts of the outer parts of Australia and the back blocks of the entire world until well into the 30s. Silent films were still being shown in some places in 1935, I dare say, in foreign countries where they wouldn't have been able to have a soundtrack in their own language anyway. So it was not, commercially speaking, it was a pretty quick process that the owners, the inventors and the patenters and the owners of the sound recording process and sound reproducing process managed to team up. I know it was strenuous for a period there, a bit like VHS and beta in tape. But when they managed to team up, and by the way, Joseph Kennedy, the father of Jack Kennedy, was important in this because he later had shortly had the film distribution company RKO radio Keith Orpheum. He was instrumental in this transition to sound period, and a ruthless financial operator he was. So if he pushed that through, that's how it happened. So in some respects, from a big city point of view, the transition to sound was fairly quick, but in more widely, I think it was actually quite slow.
And I'm just going to hop in here and say that since we've mentioned the film, the McDonough sisters film, The Cheetahs, to let everybody know that the Melbourne Friends are going to be having a webinar showing The Cheetahs in August. And we've got with Graham Shirley, he's going to handle that film. So there you are. We'll be seeing The Cheetahs in August, and I think we will be seeing the final sound version. I think, is that right? Do you think, Bruce? Or anyway, it doesn't matter, but I think that's what we're doing. Yes. Yep.
I'm not sure.
Maybe you want to go back to the next, some of the other.
Well,
Bruce,
Peter had another part of his question, which I think Adrian also has a little bit to comment on. So maybe if Peter asks that, and then Adrian supplements that, and then maybe people might want to speak to that.
Well, can I say first that we've only got till 1:30, and that I think I only allocated till 3:30. But can that be extended, Bruce?
That will be all right, but I don't think we should go beyond that time anyway.
Okay.
Just for people's bladders and so on.
3:30, I think, so good. Thanks, Graham.
Well, I just thought I'd better point, because that gives us about 15 minutes more.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for those comments about all those silent films that were made. I didn't realise, Adrian, that were made in Australia in the late 20s. But I just wanted to know what your thoughts were, David and John, about Fatty Finn, and whether it was an homage to the original Fatty Finn kid steaks, or whether it was perhaps something a little less valuable than that.
Well, I'll hop in and say I think it was a little bit less valuable. I'm the first to say that if any group of people can get together and get a film made and get the film on the screen and on multiple screens and running to audiences all over the place, well, good luck to them, because anyone who can do that, that's a hard task. Speaking in the perspective of the whole of the cinema and so on, I think that the 1980 film, and of course Bob Ellis was always too damn wordy in his films. He didn't write pictures, he wrote words. So it's nice that there was a film made of Fatty Finn, but I think we can treat them as two completely separate entities.
John, do you have any comments on? Oh, John's left the screen for the moment.
You're there, John.
I am still, yes.
Oh, good. Sorry.
No, I
Do you
don't
have any
have
further comments to make about other silent films or?
no, except that the silent film, and I was already, call me an adult, I was 18 or something when I saw it for the first time at Kid Stakes. I was, how shall I put it, in looking at the film Kid Stakes, I am removed and watching something, I can feel sympathy but not empathy for the characters and the situations they're in. Whereas the comic, which I had looked at Fatty Finn in comic form when younger, the experience for me in looking at the comics when I was still a school kid was that I could expand my own feelings, not only toward those characters, but also I'd like to imagine, or perhaps the better thing to say here is fantasize, if I were with them, if I were present with those characters in the comic strip and in those situations where they were, what would I be doing too? So that the comic, what's the word I want? Excited something creative within me, very personal, not something to be made into a work to be studied and enjoyed by the world, but for myself. But I was what's the best word? I don't want to say inspired, but still motivated to do that. Whereas in the case of the film and I were separate from each other, and I was able to communicate with it in an emotionally controlled way. But with the comic, no. The comic caused me to wish to imagine, to fantasize. I didn't, as I'd done with a few other things, I didn't fabricate. I didn't try to write any additional comic strip of my own, which I had done with a few other films. When I was still a school kid, I would write entire page after page of illustrated comics, usually inspired by films. You know, so like John Wayne in Flying Tigers or something of that kind. That went on for a couple of dozen pages. But that was what the films were doing to me when I was young, was that they were motivating me to create. When I got that little bit older, I turned into that other, what shall we say, that other function that's part of the artistic phenomenon. I was a critic. And I make a distinction between reviewers and critics. For me, a reviewer writes about whatever work of art it may be, writes about that or broadcasts about it to people who have not yet seen it or read it or heard it. Whereas the critic writes about the work for people who have. So if people know the work, then the critic addresses them. If the people don't know the work yet, it's a reviewer who addresses them. Yes, I was a critic when I looked at the Kid Stakes. I wasn't fantasizing myself, but I was enriched by someone else's fantasizing.
Thank you, John.
I don't know if others feel
you want to call in our next questioner?
Yeah, and look, I think probably this should be the last one. And it's actually a really good point that Alex has just brought up in the chat, which is just wanting to know a little bit more about the film societies meeting in the pubs in the 50s and 60s. Was there a reason, I could think of the answer, why pubs were the meeting place?
Well, if I'm being asked, I'm not aware that it was so. In Sydney, there was nowhere to go after 6 o'clock, of course, except Rippin's coffee shops, and one could stay in Rippin's. And there was a little place actually near the Prince Edward called the Marguerite. That was very, very upmarket. You could have raisin toast there. And if you cared to, you stay too long, you would miss the last train home. But yes, many a discussion was held about films in the later part of the evening in places like that.
Well, Bruce, do you think this might be it? It's time. Okay, well, look, perhaps we will call it a day. And thank you, Graham, for organising the Zoom, by the way.
Well,
And for Sorry.
You're fine. You're welcome, of course.
Yeah, good, thank you. And to Bruce for handling the tech side of things. I have an enormous thank you to David Donaldson and John Flaus. I feel this really has been a historic occasion, and I'm so glad it's been recorded. And I want to thank you both very, very much, and also to thank all our participants, especially those two in the United Kingdom. Thank you all. Thank you all, and goodbye.
And thank you, Gwenda.
Pleasure.